My theory in directing actors is to not insert the ego. I've worked with, having come up in that side of the business, I'm very, very sympathetic to the securities and insecurities.
Clint Eastwood didn't fear many men in Hollywood, but Charles Bronson was different. Not because they argued, not because they competed for the same roles, and not because they disliked each other. It was something colder and far more unsettling, because when Clint finally spoke about Bronson decades later, he didn't call him a rival or a friend or an enemy. He said 9 words he had never used about anyone else. He was the only man I never underestimated. That wasn't admiration. It wasn't praise. It was respect. The dangerous kind. The kind that isn't performed. The kind that isn't negotiated. The kind that only exists between 2 men who recognize something in each other and don't like how familiar it feels. And in this story, we're going to look at why. Why Clint Eastwood refused to share the screen with Charles Bronson, why the two avoided direct confrontation for decades, and why the silence between them said more than any public statement ever could. Because this wasn't Hollywood rivalry, it was something much deeper, something both men understood and neither of them ever wanted to speak about. Charles Bronson didn't grow up dreaming about movies. He grew up underground. Raised in a coal mining family in Pennsylvania, he didn't spend his childhood planning a future. He spent it trying to survive the present. By the age of 10, he was already working to help feed his family. No spotlight, no glamour, no safety net. Just dust, darkness, and work. Hard work. Work that didn't ask how you felt, only whether you could keep going. And in that world, you didn't talk much. You didn't complain. You didn't ask for comfort. You learned one thing: endure or break. And Bronson never broke. He didn't become quiet because he was mysterious. He became quiet because life taught him early that words were useless, but strength wasn't. Years later, when he stepped in front of a camera, people thought they were watching a performance. They weren't. They were looking at a man who had already lived through more than any character he would ever play. He didn't act tough. He had survived into toughness, and Clint Eastwood recognized that instantly. Clint came from a different path, but the lesson felt familiar. He grew up during the Great Depression. Nothing was stable. Nothing was guaranteed. He had to move from place to place, job to job, never fully settling, never fully belonging. And just like Bronson, he learned young, if you want control, nobody is going to hand it to you. You build it, brick by brick, through distance, through discipline, through silence. Clint didn't talk more than he had to. He didn't reveal more than he needed. He turned restraint into a tool, and eventually into a myth. The stare, the slow movements, the voice that rarely rose above a murmur. He didn't need to shout to be heard. Silence did the work for him. But Bronson's silence was different. Clint used silence. Bronson came from silence. And that difference, small as it seems, changed everything. When the 2 men finally entered the same orbit in Hollywood, people expected tension, but not this kind, not this quiet, not this controlled, not this heavy. There was no public feud, no dramatic confrontation, no headline-ready conflict, just stillness. A room where both men were present, and neither was willing to yield. Not verbally, not physically, not emotionally. Crew members later said you could feel it when they were near each other. Not hostility, not ego, just awareness. 2 men who understood instantly that they were facing someone who didn't need to pretend. A man who didn't need performance to be intimidating. A man who had already lived the thing everyone else was playing. And you don't underestimate a man like that, not even if you're Clint Eastwood. Hollywood studios wanted them together on screen. They imagined it as the ultimate pairing. 2 cold, controlled, quiet giants in one film. The toughest faces of their generation: Clint Eastwood, Charles Bronson, a guaranteed box office success. Directors pitched ideas, producers called agents, scripts were floated. But it never happened, and that wasn't an accident. Both men turned down projects that would have put them side by side in leading roles. Not because they were afraid, not because they disliked each other, but because they both understood a truth that Hollywood executives didn't. There wasn't enough room in a single frame for two men who carried that much presence. If they ever stood at equal ground on screen, the audience wouldn't be watching the film. They'd be measuring the men. Who seemed stronger? Who felt real? Who dominated the space without speaking? And neither Clint nor Bronson was willing to be the one who lost that unspoken battle. So they stayed apart, professionally, strategically, silently. And that silence created a mythology of its own. But it wasn't rivalry in the traditional sense. It wasn't about insecurity or ego. It was about recognition. Clint Eastwood built his image with precision. He chose roles carefully, controlled tone, controlled movement, controlled myth. He crafted the kind of man the world believed him to be. Bronson didn't craft anything. He brought his past with him, onto every set, into every role, into every silent stare that made audiences uncomfortable without knowing why. To Clint, that wasn't performance. That was danger. Not physical danger, existential danger. Because in Bronson, Clint saw something he'd spent his life working to avoid becoming. A man who no longer separated life from persona. A man who was the thing he projected. No distance, no barrier, no mask. Just raw, unfiltered presence. And men like that don't get underestimated. Not by other men who understand what it costs to become one. There was a story told years later about a quiet dinner, not public, not recorded, just a few people seated around a table. Someone asked Clint about Bronson. They expected a funny anecdote, a lighthearted memory, maybe even a compliment. Instead, Clint went quiet, longer than usual. Then he said, "Some men don't act tough. They survive into it." He didn't add anything else. He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't need to, because everyone at that table understood something in that moment. He wasn't just talking about Charles Bronson. He was talking about himself, about a generation of men who didn't have the luxury of softness, who built silence into armor because life never gave them a safe place to speak. And when those men meet, they don't shake hands and call each other brothers. They measure, quietly, carefully, respectfully, and then they keep their distance. But there was more to the story than distance, more to the unspoken understanding between two men who rarely acknowledged each other publicly, but who understood each other completely. Because the truth is, avoidance isn't always about weakness. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly what would happen if you didn't avoid something. And both Clint and Bronson knew. The first time they were in the same room together was at an industry event in the late 1960s. Neither man wanted to be there. Both had been pressured by their agents, their studios, their publicists. These events were part of the job. Smile for cameras, shake hands, play the game. Most actors treated them like performances, another role to play. The charming star, the gracious professional, the humble artist. But Clint and Bronson didn't perform well at these things. Not because they couldn't, but because they refused to pretend that standing in a room full of people who didn't know you, talking about nothing, meant anything at all. People who were there remembered the moment. Clint entered from one side, Bronson from another. The room was crowded, loud, full of the kind of empty conversation that fills Hollywood gatherings. And then both men noticed each other. Not dramatically, not with any visible reaction, just a glance, a nod, the kind of acknowledgement that says, "I see you, I know what you are, and I'm not interested in playing whatever game everyone else here is playing." They didn't approach each other, didn't seek conversation. They simply existed in the same space with a kind of territorial awareness, like two wolves in a forest who understand that fighting serves no purpose when both are already alpha. You acknowledge, you respect the boundary, you move on. And that's exactly what they did. For the rest of the evening, they orbited different parts of the room, never close, never far enough to seem like deliberate avoidance, just maintaining distance, not out of fear, out of understanding. Because here's what most people don't grasp about men like Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson. They didn't avoid each other because of competition. They avoided each other because they recognized that their presence together would create a tension that nobody could resolve, a question that couldn't be answered without someone losing something they'd spent their entire career building. Hollywood is built on hierarchy, on knowing where you stand, on understanding who's at the top. And for most actors, that hierarchy is negotiated through box office numbers, critical acclaim, award wins, public perception. There are metrics, data, ways to measure who's more successful. But Clint and Bronson existed outside that system. Their power wasn't about numbers, it was about presence, about the unquantifiable weight they carried, about the way audiences felt something when they appeared on screen, something primal, something that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. And when you have two men who operate on that level, putting them together doesn't create synergy, it creates collision. Because the audience will instinctively measure them against each other, not consciously, not deliberately, but somewhere deep in their response, they'll be asking, which one is real? Which one do I believe? Which one would I follow into the darkness? And both Clint and Bronson knew that question had no good answer. Because they were both real. They'd both earned their presence through genuine experience. They'd both survived things that forged them into who they were. And asking an audience to choose between them would diminish both. So, they chose not to ask. They chose distance. And in that distance, they maintained something more valuable than collaboration. They maintained respect. The kind that doesn't need to be proven, the kind that exists precisely because it's never tested. There were moments when their careers paralleled so closely it seemed inevitable they'd collide. In the 1970s, both were at the height of their powers. Clint with Dirty Harry, the outlaw Jose Wales, Escape from Alcatraz. Bronson with Death Wish, The Mechanic, Hard Times. Both playing men pushed to the edge, men who'd been wronged, men who took justice into their own hands. Film critics constantly compared them. Audiences debated who was tougher. Studio executives wanted to capitalize on both. And somewhere in all that noise, there were multiple attempts to bring them together. Scripts were written specifically for both of them. Westerns where they'd be partners, crime thrillers where they'd be adversaries, war films where they'd fight side by side. Every single project fell apart. Not publicly, not with dramatic statements. They just quietly never happened. Scheduling conflicts, they'd say. Creative differences. Budget issues. The usual Hollywood reasons projects die. But people close to both men knew the truth. Neither wanted to do it, and neither had to explain why. Their agents understood. The directors understood. Even the studio executives eventually understood. You don't force two forces of nature into the same space and expect harmony. You get destruction. Or worse, you get nothing. You get two men so careful not to overshadow each other that they both become less than they are separately. There was one project that came closest, a Western in the mid-1970s. Big budget, serious director, script that actually made sense for both of them. They'd play aging gunslingers, former partners who'd gone separate ways, brought back together for one last job. The perfect setup, the natural pairing everyone had been waiting for. Clint read the script, liked it, said yes, then asked who else was attached. When he heard Bronson's name, he went quiet. Thought about it for 3 days, then called his agent and pulled out. No explanation, no demands to rewrite it, no attempt to make it work, just no. Bronson never even got to the yes. When his agent pitched it and mentioned Clint was interested, Bronson just shook his head. "Won't work," he said, and that was the end of the conversation. The project died, the director moved on, And years later, when someone asked Clint why he passed on what seemed like such a perfect role, he gave an answer that revealed everything. Sometimes the best performances are the ones you don't give. Sometimes knowing what not to do is more important than knowing what to do. He wasn't talking about the script, he was talking about the dynamic, the unspoken understanding that some combinations, no matter how compelling on paper, don't work in reality. Not because of inability, but because of excess. Too much presence, too much weight in one frame. And as the years went on, both men's careers evolved. Clint moved into directing, creating some of the most powerful films of the late 20th century. Unforgiven, $1 Million Baby, Gran Torino. Films that explored aging, violence, redemption, regret. Films that showed a side of masculinity Hollywood rarely examined. The cost of being hard, the weight of never bending, the loneliness of strength. And in those films, you could see Clint grappling with something that looked a lot like the question Bronson represented. What happens to men who survive into toughness? What happens when the armor you built to protect yourself becomes a prison? What happens when you've spent so long being unbreakable that you've forgotten how to bend? Bronson's later career was different. He kept acting, kept playing the same types of roles, but something had shifted. The intensity was still there, the presence remained, but there was a weariness underneath, a sense that he was carrying something heavy, something that had nothing to do with the characters he played and everything to do with who he'd become. When Bronson died in 2003, Clint didn't make a public statement, didn't give interviews, didn't offer the kind of Hollywood tribute that's expected when legends pass. He stayed silent, but people close to him said he took the news hard, harder than anyone expected. Because Bronson's death meant something to Clint that had nothing to do with friendship or collaboration. It meant the last person who truly understood had left. The last person who'd lived the same transformation, who'd survived into toughness and carried that weight for decades, who knew what it cost to be unbreakable, who understood that the armor never comes off, even when you're alone. And maybe that's why Clint finally spoke about him years later, not immediately after his death, not in some calculated tribute, but quietly, in a small gathering, when someone mentioned Bronson's name and asked what Clint remembered about him. And Clint, who rarely spoke about other actors, who built his career on saying less, who turned silence into art, said more than he'd ever said about another man in Hollywood. "He was the only man I never underestimated," he began. And then, after a pause that felt like it carried decades of weight, he continued. "People think toughness is about not breaking, but that's not it. Real toughness is about what you do after you've already been broken. It's about getting up when you have every reason to stay down." Bronson understood that. He lived it, and he never pretended otherwise. Someone asked if they'd been friends. Clint shook his head. "We weren't friends. We were something else. We were witnesses to what men become when they survive things that should have destroyed them." He talked about the coal mines, about Bronson working underground as a child, about coming back from war and having to build a life from nothing, about the years of small roles and rejection, about finally achieving stardom in his 40s when most actors have already peaked, about carrying all of that into every role he played. "He didn't act," Clint said. "He just showed you what survival looks like." And then Clint said something that made everyone listening understand why he'd avoided sharing a screen with Bronson for their entire careers. "If we'd worked together, really worked together, shared a film as equals, the audience would have seen too much. They would have seen what we both knew but never said. That all of it, the toughness, the silence, the control, all of it comes from fear. Not fear of others, fear of what happens if you stop being that person for even a moment. Fear that if you let the armor down, you won't be able to put it back up. And I don't think either of us wanted that exposed." That's the truth nobody talks about. That's the real reason two of Hollywood's toughest icons never worked together. Not because they were rivals, not because they competed, but because together they would have revealed the cost of what they'd both become. And neither was ready for that. Neither wanted to risk the myth, because the myth was all they had left. Years later, someone asked Clint if he regretted never working with Bronson, if he wished they'd taken one of those projects that almost happened, if he thought audiences missed out on something historic. Clint thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "No, some things are better left as possibility. Some collaborations are more powerful when they never happen, because then they can be whatever you need them to be. But if we'd actually done it, we would have just been two old men trying to pretend we were still unbreakable, and neither of us was very good at pretending." And that was the final word, the most honest thing Clint Eastwood ever said about Charles Bronson. Not that he was tough, not that he was talented, not that he was a legend, but that he was real. And sometimes being real means knowing when not to expose yourself, when not to test the armor, when to maintain the distance that keeps the myth intact. Because in the end, that's what both men understood, that their power came not from what they did, but from what they represented. And working together would have forced them to be just actors, just men, just two survivors trying to make it through another day. And both of them had spent too long being more than that to risk becoming less. Clint Eastwood didn't admire many men. He never pretended otherwise. He respected professionalism. He respected discipline. He respected strength that came from experience rather than performance. And Charles Bronson embodied all of it, not loudly, not publicly, not in interviews or headlines, but in presence. Presence that didn't try to impress anyone, presence that didn't chase attention, presence that didn't need recognition to exist. And that's why, even decades later, Clint still chose his words carefully. He didn't romanticize, he didn't over-explain, he simply didn't wrap it in sentiment. He simply said, "He was the only man I never underestimated." Not because Bronson was perfect, not because he was stronger, but because Clint understood what he had to survive to become the man he was. And when you understand that, you don't challenge it, you don't test it, you respect it, quietly, for the rest of your life. If you found this story worth your time, make sure to like, subscribe, share, and tell us your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching.